Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. This time, we're exploring Surah 43 from the Quran. Az-Zukhruf, which translates to the ornaments, or the gold adornments. Now, I gotta admit, when I first saw the title, I pictured something totally different, like maybe a surah celebrating beautiful things.
It is a bit of a head-scratcher, isn't it? You'd think a surah named after luxurious gold ornaments would be all about wealth and worldly possessions, but it's really quite the opposite.
It's like being handed a beautifully wrapped gift box, but inside you find a guide to simple living. That contrast makes me even more curious to dig into what this surah is really about.
Well, that's what makes the Quran so fascinating. It often uses unexpected imagery to challenge our assumptions, and in this case, Az-Zukhruf uses the allure of worldly ornaments to highlight the greater value of spiritual riches.
Okay, so right off the bat, Az-Zukhruf emphasizes the importance of clarity and understanding. Verses 3 and 4 state that the Quran was revealed in Arabic so people could easily grasp its message.
Right, and there's a deeper significance to this. Imagine receiving a message in a language you don't understand. You might get the gist, but you'd miss the nuances, the poetry, the emotional impact. Revealing the Quran in the language of its intended audience was a way of ensuring the message was clear, direct and accessible to everyone.
No more excuses for misunderstanding, Race. It's all right there in plain language. And this emphasis on clarity makes me think about how Az-Zukhruf tackles the issue of rejecting prophets. Verses 6 through 8 talk about how past generations rejected the messenger sent to guide them. It's like this recurring pattern throughout history.
It really is, and it's not just about religion either. Think about any time someone tries to introduce a new idea, whether it's a scientific discovery or a new way of thinking, there's often resistance, even outright hostility. It's like people would rather cling to what's familiar, even if it might be wrong, than embrace something new and potentially challenging.
You know, I can totally relate to that. Even in my own life, I sometimes find myself resisting change, even when I know it might be good for me. It makes me wonder what's going on there, psychologically speaking.
That's a great question, and it's one that Az-Zukhruf explores in a really interesting way. Verse 9 points out that even those who disbelieve acknowledge God as the creator of the heavens and the earth.
Wait, so even in their disbelief, they recognize a higher power? That seems kind of contradictory.
It might seem that way, but think about it this way. It's like deep down, everyone knows there's something bigger than themselves, some force or intelligence behind the incredible complexity and beauty of the universe. But acknowledging that creator is one thing. Accepting their guidance and changing your life accordingly is a whole other challenge.
That makes sense. It's like admitting you need to eat healthy and exercise.
Yeah.
But then continuing to indulge in junk food and skip the gym? The knowledge is there. But putting it into practice requires a whole other level of commitment.
Exactly. And that's where the concept of idolatry comes in. Az-Zukhruf is very clear in its condemnation of associating partners with God, or attributing daughters to him, as we see in verses 15 to 20.
Now, full disclosure, coming from a background outside of Islam, the concept of idolatry isn't something I've given much thought to. So help me unpack this a bit. What's the core issue here?
Sure, I can see how that might seem foreign. Basically, the surah is saying that worshiping anything other than God, whether it's physical idols or abstract concepts like wealth or power, is a form of misplacing your devotion. It's like focusing all your energy on a flickering candle when you have the sun shining right above you.
Ah, I get it. So it's not just about statues or images. It's about anything that takes the place of God in your heart. That becomes your ultimate focus and source of meaning. And Az-Zukhruf argues that when we do that, we're essentially missing the point.
Exactly. And the surah doesn't just make a blanket statement. It uses reason and logic to dismantle the arguments in favor of idolatry. For instance, in verse 16, it poses a question that really made me stop and think. Or has he chosen for himself daughters from what he creates and favored you with sons?
Whoa, that's a powerful line. It challenges the very idea of attributing gender to God, doesn't it?
Right. It forces you to confront the limitations of human understanding when trying to grasp the nature of the divine. And then there's this vivid imagery in verse 18, where those attributed as daughters to God are described as being beautiful but powerless. It highlights the absurdity of such a belief.
You know what strikes me is that the surah doesn't just condemn idolatry. It engages in this thoughtful debate, using reason and imagery to expose the flaws in the logic. That approach feels really different from what I might have expected.
It's very much in line with the Quran's overall approach of inviting people to think critically and question their assumptions. And to further illustrate this point, Az-Zukhruf uses a story that's central to several faiths, the story of Abraham.
Yes. Verses 26 through 28 describe Abraham's unwavering faith in the one God. and his rejection of his people's idols.
It's a story that resonates across cultures and religions, and it highlights the courage it takes to stand up for your beliefs, even when faced with opposition from those closest to you.
It's a reminder that faith isn't just about blindly following tradition. It's about actively seeking truth and being willing to challenge even the most deeply ingrained beliefs.
And that courage to seek truth despite the challenges is a theme that resonates throughout Az-Zukhruf.
Now, earlier we talked about the contrast between the surah's name, Az-Zukhruf, and its message. How does the surah address this tension between worldly possessions and the afterlife?
Well, it uses some incredibly vivid imagery to do just that. For example, verses 33 through 35 describe worldly possessions in such detail. Gold, silver, luxurious furnishings, almost painting this picture of opulence.
Yeah, and then in verse 35, it immediately shifts to describing the hereafter as the true reward for the righteous. It's like holding up a sparkling diamond next to a vast starlit sky. One catches your eye, but the other is eternal.
That's a beautiful analogy, and I think that's exactly what Az-Zukhruf is trying to do, to shift our perspective, to help us see beyond the fleeting allure of material things, and recognize the true value of what lies beyond this world.
It makes me think about how easily we can get caught up in the pursuit of more stuff, more status, more comfort. But Az-Zukhruf seems to be saying, hey, there's something so much bigger and more fulfilling than all that.
And to really drive that point home, it doesn't just rely on abstract ideas. It uses powerful historical examples, like the encounter between Moses and Pharaoh, as recounted in verses 46 through 50.
Oh yes, the classic story of the arrogant ruler blinded by his own power. Thinking about it now, that story feels incredibly relevant today, even though it happened centuries ago.
Absolutely. We see similar power dynamics playing out all around us. Politicians, CEOs, even social media influencers. People who amass power and then become so convinced of their own rightness that they refuse to listen to anyone else, even when they're clearly heading for a fall.
It's like a cautionary tale about the dangers of ego and the importance of staying humble, no matter how much power or success you achieve.
Exactly. And it speaks to a core message in Az-Zukhruf, which is about recognizing that true power lies not in worldly dominance, but in aligning yourself with God's will.
It's interesting how Az-Zukhruf doesn't just focus on the big dramatic stories like Moses and Pharaoh. It also zooms in on the more internal struggles we face, especially when it comes to resisting negative influences.
Absolutely, and that's where the surah's emphasis on God's power over human hearts and minds really comes into play. Verse 36, for instance, states, "Whoever shuns the remembrance of the most gracious way, we assign for him a devil to be his companion."
Okay, so let's break this down. It sounds like it's saying that when we turn away from God, we create a void in ourselves.
Yeah.
And that void can be filled by negative influences.
Exactly. It's not necessarily about a literal devil sitting on your shoulder, but rather the idea that when we neglect our spiritual connection, we become more susceptible to negative thoughts, emotions, and influences that can lead us astray.
It's like a spiritual law of attraction almost. If you're not actively cultivating positivity and connection to something greater, then negativity will inevitably seep in. And that can be so subtle, can't it?
Absolutely, and that's what makes it so dangerous. Verse 37 goes on to describe how these negative influences can make even wrong actions seem appealing, even righteous.
That's a scary thought.
Yeah.
To be so convinced you're on the right path when you're actually heading in the wrong direction.
It really highlights the importance of self-reflection and constantly checking in with our intentions and motivations. Are we acting out of genuine goodness, or are we being driven by ego fear or some other negative force?
That's a question we could all probably benefit from asking ourselves more often. Regardless of our religious beliefs, it's so easy to get caught up in our own self-righteousness without realizing the underlying motivations. So how does Az-Zukhruf guide us in staying on the right path, in avoiding those pitfalls?
Well, in verse 43 it states, "So adhere to what is revealed to you. You are upon a straight path." This emphasizes the importance of following the guidance provided by God's revelations. In this case, the teachings of the Quran.
Right, because this deep dive is specifically focused on the Quran. So that's the revelation being referred to here. And it's not just about individual guidance either, is it? Verse 44 goes on to say that this message is for the entire community, and they will be held accountable for how they respond to it.
Exactly. It emphasizes the social dimension of faith. Our beliefs and actions have ripple effects. They impact those around us, our communities, and ultimately the world as a whole.
It makes me think about the concept of accountability, which Az-Zukhruf seems to bring up quite frequently, especially in relation to the Day of Judgment.
Absolutely. Verses 66 and 67 describe the Day of Judgment as this monumental event, where worldly relationships dissolve and new ones are formed based on righteousness.
Sounds like a cosmic sorting hat, separating those who chose the path of goodness from those who didn't. And Az-Zukhruf doesn't shy away from describing both the rewards and the consequences, right?
It's very clear in its depiction of both. In verses 68 through 70, we get this beautiful description of paradise, of entering the garden with loved ones, filled with joy and bliss. It's a vision of eternal fulfillment and peace.
It's like a glimpse into the ultimate reward for a life well lived, for choosing kindness, compassion, and connection with the divine. And then on the flip side, verses 74 through 76 depict the torment of hell, the consequence of choosing a path that leads away from God.
Right, and what's interesting is that it presents both heaven and hell as natural consequences of our choices. It's not about God arbitrarily punishing or rewarding, but rather about the inherent alignment or misalignment of our actions with the divine will.
It's like saying, look, you have free will. You can choose to plant seeds of kindness and compassion, or you can choose to plant seeds of greed and selfishness. But ultimately, you're the one who has to live with the harvest.
That's a great way to put it. And that emphasis on free will and accountability really makes the message of Az-Zukhruf feel so relevant. Even in today's world, we're constantly bombarded with choices, with messages pulling us in different directions. This surah reminds us that we have the power to choose our path, and that those choices have lasting consequences.
Now, speaking of choices and messages, there's a passage towards the end of Az-Zukhruf that I found particularly striking. Verses 81 through 83 address a common misconception about Islamic beliefs, right?
Yes, these verses are often cited to clarify the Islamic understanding of God's oneness and to refute the idea of a trinity or that God has offspring.
Right, because verse 81 actually states, say, if the most gracious had a son, I would be the first to worship. It's almost like the surah is anticipating a potential misunderstanding.
Yeah.
And directly addressing it head on.
Exactly. And then to make it even clearer, verse 82 reaffirms the absolute unity of God, stating, glorified be the Lord of the heavens and the earth the Lord of the throne beyond what they describe.
So it's not just about debunking a specific misconception, but also about emphasizing this core Islamic belief in the unique and transcendent nature of God. But then verse 83 throws in this curveball that honestly left me a bit confused.
Yes. So leave them to blunder and play until they encounter their day, which they are promised. It's a line that can be interpreted in various ways.
Exactly. It's a line that sparked a lot of debate and discussion. And I'm curious to hear your take on it. Some might interpret it as a harsh dismissal of those who hold different beliefs. But you mentioned earlier that the Quran often encourages critical thinking and questioning. So how do we reconcile those two things?
That's a great point. I think the key here is understanding that the Quran is addressing a specific audience at a specific time. In this context, it's speaking to those who are actively rejecting the message, who are choosing to remain blind to the truth.
So rather than a blanket condemnation of anyone who doesn't agree, it's more about acknowledging the consequences of willfully rejecting a clear path, of choosing to blunder and play instead of seeking a deeper understanding.
Exactly. And it ties back to that theme of accountability we were discussing earlier. Az-Zukhruf makes it clear that we have the freedom to choose, but those choices have consequences both in this life and the next.
And that brings us back to the central message of Az-Zukhruf, recognizing God's power and guidance, making choices aligned with that guidance, and understanding that ultimately we'll be accountable for those choices.
It's a message that resonates across cultures and time periods, prompting us to examine our own lives and to ask ourselves what truly matters. Am I pursuing the fleeting ornaments of this world, or am I seeking the enduring riches of the hereafter?
And honestly, I think those are questions we could all benefit from pondering, regardless of our background or beliefs. As we wrap up our deep dive into Az-Zukhruf, I'm struck by how this surah manages to be both timeless and incredibly timely. You know, it speaks to these universal human struggles, with temptation, pride, and the search for meaning, but it also feels incredibly relevant to the challenges we face in the modern world.
I completely agree. Think about it. We're constantly bombarded with messages telling us to buy more, achieve more, be more. It's easy to get swept up in that pursuit of ornaments, as Zukhruf calls them, and lose sight of what truly matters.
Yeah, it's like that saying, we buy things we don't need with money we don't have to impress people we don't like. Az-Zukhruf seems to be offering a much-needed antidote to that kind of thinking, urging us to reevaluate our priorities and focus on something more enduring.
Right. It's about recognizing that true fulfillment doesn't come from accumulating possessions or chasing fleeting pleasures. It comes from aligning our lives with a higher purpose, from cultivating those inner qualities of compassion, gratitude, and connection with the divine.
It makes me think about how often we measure success by external markers, wealth, status, achievements. But Az-Zukhruf challenges us to consider a different metric, one based on our inner state, our character, and the impact we have on others.
And that's a radical shift in perspective, isn't it? It's about moving away from a scarcity mindset, where we're constantly striving for more, to a mindset of abundance, where we recognize the true riches that come from living a life of meaning and purpose.
And that reminds me of the story of Abraham rejecting the idols of his people. It took incredible courage to stand up to those ingrained beliefs and choose a different path, a path based on faith and a direct connection with God.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that true faith often requires us to question the status quo, to challenge our assumptions, and to be willing to stand alone if necessary.
And it also makes me think about the story of Moses and Pharaoh. Here's this powerful ruler, surrounded by wealth and luxury, yet ultimately blinded by his own pride and ego. It's a cautionary tale about how worldly power without a grounding in something greater can lead to corruption and ultimately destruction.
That's such an important point. Az-Zukhruf isn't anti-wealth or anti-success. It's about recognizing that those things can be traps if they become our ultimate focus, if they pull us away from our connection to God, and from living a life of service and compassion.
So as we wrap up our deep dive, I want to leave you with a question to ponder. How do the themes we've explored in Az-Zukhruf resonate with your own life?
Yes. Think about your own priorities, your values, the choices you make each day. Are you drawn to the ornaments of this world? Or are you seeking something more?
How can you apply the lessons of Az-Zukhruf to navigate the complexities of modern life? To find that balance between worldly success and spiritual fulfillment, it's a journey we're all on, and I hope this deep dive has provided some food for thought, some inspiration to keep seeking, and some guidance on that path.
And remember, the exploration doesn't end here. Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep striving to connect with that deeper truth within yourself and in the world around you.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Surah Az-Zukhruf. Until next time, keep seeking knowledge and keep diving deep.